So we're going to spend the rest of the time just kind of going through and looking at putting all this together. So our first session, we talked a lot about herbicides and how you select herbicides to kind of come up with a program that's going to increase the amount of time before we get resistance, things like rotating modes of action, make sure we're using the right rate, all those different things that go into the herbicide plan. And tonight we're learning more about what are the other integrated technologies that we can use in that system. So, you know, we have lots of examples, but mixing things up. And so really another way that we can look at this is we have a large toolbox here, and there's lots of different tools in that toolbox. We're getting new tools all the time. I'm really excited about this harvest weed seed control technology that's coming up, and glad to see that actually being installed on combines and in practice there in Virginia. I think that's probably one of the first machines that's been in this side of the Mississippi. Is that right, Michael?
Yeah, to my knowledge, it's the only one operating on a commercial farm on the East Coast. So there is another one at the USDA facility there in Beltsville on a research station.
Okay. So that's, you know, kind of excited to see that new technology and the new tools being added all the time. But then there's also tools that have been out there for a long time that anybody that's worked on the farm, I'm sure, has spent some time hand weeding or hoeing or pulling weeds. If we go back long enough, even spending some time, you know, plowing some ground. You know, it's looking at what works for what situation. Just like we might have a different tool for doing a different job on a piece of equipment, we're going to have a different tool when working out there in the field for weed control. And normally it's not just going to be one, it's going to be a lot of them. So let's get as many tools as we can to get as good of a fight as we can. So this is just an example here of kind of putting it all together of what that might look like. I'm not going to go over each of these different sections here, but it all starts on a base of prevention and trying to make sure that we don't get those weeds to begin with, particularly some of the harder control weeds like Palmer amaranth that's been very successful at jumping states and showing up where we never thought we would see it. So if you don't have it, don't get it. And then once you do get it, manage it and use a lot of different techniques at one time. So what we're going to do is we actually have some scenarios that we have here. We're going to go over, and the first one, we're actually going to use the panelist here. We're going to put the speakers on the spot, and I have some ideas, but we're also going to get some input from those folks as well. So this is going to be our classic example of continuous beans. We have soybeans that are going to be harvested October 15th, and then planted next year. We're going to go back to beans May 10th, and we have a number of weeds there. It's about a 25-acre field. Soil is very drought prone, and it's a challenge to grow corn there. You're getting ready to harvest. Weed problems. Morning glory has been a problem in the past. Large crabgrass. You've used broadaxe, which is a dual plus sulfentrazone product, the past 3 years as a residual. But in the last couple of years, you've noticed some common ragweed coming in. And things like Pursuit, First Rate, Glyphosate have not controlled that. So we're going to assume that ragweed is ALS and Roundup or glyphosate resistant. So what are some things we might consider as we kind of walk through the season here? All right. So in real life, what does that field look like? So here's some beans. This is from Southern Maryland, and we see some ragweed there the previous season. And the next season, it's just spread a little bit more. And harvest time, that doesn't look like it's much fun getting that off. All right, so first question, what are your plans for that field you're getting ready to take off before, during, or after harvest? Well, is there anything you can do at this point in time in terms of weed management? So some ideas that we might think about. First of all, some folks might say, well, we need to go pull that ragweed up. But remember with ragweed, it sets seeds fairly early, and those seeds actually drop off the plant. So pulling plants at harvest time is not quite as effective. Now, if we were to get to those plants earlier in the season before they set seed, that would be a different story. One of the important things that I recommend is always mapping, just making a note of where those weeds are in that field for next year, so we can manage that and know what areas to avoid. Maybe consider when we're planning our techniques for the following year. And then finally, even though most of those seeds have dropped off, anytime you're going to herbicide resistant field, you want to make sure that you isolate that portion of the field, harvest that last, and then clean the combine. And finally, we have an option there about a cover crop. And this is one that, there's some considerations there. It's October 15th or so. I think we said we were going to take the beans off. So getting a cover crop in there on time, actually getting enough biomass might be a little bit of a challenge depending upon where you're at. In this area, we're kind of right on the borderline, in terms of getting enough biomass the following spring, but certainly an option. Another consideration with that cover crop would be if it's droughty soil, is that going to steal some of our soil moisture in the spring? Now the last 2 years, that certainly hasn't been a problem for us, but so I'll ask my panelists, or anything there that I might have missed or you might consider doing as well. How about 2 to 6 weeks before planting next year's crop? What are some things that we might want to do? So this is where, particularly with ragweed, it's important that we get good burn down. So non-selective burn down, we want to make sure those weeds are killed before we plant. And consider tillage. The only issue with tillage on drought-prone soils, you're depleting that soil a lot of moisture, and that can be an issue. We also want to be planning, in the winter months, we want to be thinking about your herbicide program that you're going to be using. Right now is a great time. How are we going to get some more effective sites of action that might have a little better activity on ragweed? So sulfentrazone is a great product for Palmer amaranth, not such a great product for ragweed. So we might want to consider switching up that residual program some. We might even add in a herbicide tolerant trait technology. There are a lot of different options out there. Liberty, Extend, Enlist, many packages where you can use one or two of those technologies together. So certainly consider that as another tool in the toolbox. Narrow rows, the example I just showed was actually 30-inch rows, and narrowing those rows up some can certainly help. And then scouting early also can help. So any more suggestions from the panelists?
One thing I would suggest with the common ragweed is, your time frame was 2 to 6 weeks before of using your burn down and your residual herbicides. Delaying that application closer to planting, so that there's the residual. Your residual is going to give you a limited amount of time. You want that residual to be providing control while the crop is in the field. So delaying that application of your residual or burn down to achieve that would be one thing I'd consider.
Absolutely, yes. Great point. Any other suggestions? Right. So now we're at planting time, and the question is, how will you manage weeds at planting? So some of the options we might think about, and for ragweed in particular in our area, this is one that producers really struggle with. Is you want to ensure that early emerged ragweed is killed before planting. And so in the picture there, you can see a soybean field that was, he thought that he had cleaned that up. He had actually applied a burn down about 3 weeks prior, and he had some of those plants that survived that burn down. He didn't come in at planting and kill those small ragweed plants. And in a conventional system, with the conventional beans or just Roundup Ready beans, it's almost impossible to clean those up now once you have them at that stage. So make sure that ragweed is good and dead when those soybean plants are coming up. And then finally, to the point that Mark was making, you want to make sure you use a good pre-emergent herbicide, and that needs to be put down just as close to planting as possible. And that's not only true for ragweed, but certainly for Palmer amaranth and most of our other weeds as well. We want to be able to extend that coverage, that residual coverage, as far into the season as possible to get as much control as possible. Any other comments from the panelists? There we go. How will you manage the weeds during the growing season? So the crop is up and going. What are some things that we want to do? We want to scout for escapes, certainly keep an eye out. And the second point, and I think you heard the farmers that we listened to speak to this, is we need to make sure we get those post-emergent herbicides on just as timely as we can. Dr. Van Gessel, I know you make this point often. It's just important as to what time you put those herbicides on and that you use them timely as to what herbicide you actually use. So with ragweed, particularly with products like Reflex, Liberty, you let that ragweed get up 8 to 10 inches tall and you're just not going to catch it. So we need to get that material on time. And then finally, if we just have a few weeds, as the folks have said already, get out of the truck and pull them. You're going to save yourself a lot of headaches down the road. Any comments from the panelists as we go on?
Yeah, Ben, you mentioned scouting for escapes, and I just want to emphasize how important that is. And because this year what we've seen late germinating common ragweed, germinating as late as mid-July.
Mm-hmm. And those still have time to produce seed, I'm assuming. So 2 questions now. Should be planned for managing any escape weeds immediately before or after next year's crop is harvested? If so, please describe what you would use. And then finally, what are you going to plant the following year? So some ideas we might want to consider would be, as we talked about before, this would be a good time. If we can get those beans off even a little bit early, get a cover crop on and get that cover crop established, get some biomass in there, that would really help. And secondly, the idea of continuous soybeans is really asking for trouble. And that's typically our worst experience with herbicide resistance is when we have the same crop year after year. So rotation options, we are limited in what we can do on that soil type, but perhaps consider something like sorghum. Sorghum can be planted a little bit earlier, perhaps. Also, the biggest thing with sorghum, because it's a grass, we have a lot more herbicide options. We can use a little bit of atrazine, mix that up some, and get a little better control there. So, any comments from the panelists on this one? And now it's going to be your turn. So, what we're going to do is we're going to bring up some polling here, but I'll first set this up with a scenario. So, this is going to be corn following a soybean crop. So the soybean came off October 30th. We're going to plant corn April 15th, and we have fall panicum and Palmer amaranth are the main weed problems. So you're getting ready to harvest those beans. You have a history of fall panicum, and in addition, you're starting to see a new patch of Palmer amaranth come in on one edge of that field. So you applied dual pre-plant. 5 weeks after planting those beans, you sprayed it with glyphosate. It didn't die, so you came back and sprayed it again with glyphosate and put a little first rate in there. Both of those treatments didn't work. So we're just going to assume that the Palmer amaranth is tolerant to glyphosate and to our ALS herbicides. So what does that look like? And just to give you a little better idea, if you haven't experienced Palmer amaranth, what it can do. This is an example of that. So this is Palmer amaranth growing in a soybean field. Previous year, you can see we have lots of mature seed heads out there. This was a field that had conventional soybeans planted, and this particular field had been sprayed with glyphosate, I think 5 times total. And farmer just didn't know what he had. This was actually one of our first confirmed cases of Palmer amaranth in Southern Maryland. So 1 year, and that's what that same field looked like. The following year planted to corn. And just to give you an idea of the seed production and potential for Palmer, you still notice though that the corn is 6 to 8 inches taller than the Palmer, but there certainly is a lot of Palmer in that field. We might want to call it a Palmer field with some corn growing. So these are the questions we're going to put to the audience. We'll just go ahead and go through those. So I'm going to start the poll here. And we're going to start with question number 15. Just bear with me while I launch this. Okay, so what we want everyone to do out there that can is to go ahead and select all of these choices for each of the questions. The first question is, what would you do before the soybean harvest? Second question is, what are your plans for the field during soybean harvest? So while you're harvesting. And then finally, what are your plans for the field immediately after soybean harvest? So folks can go ahead and if you want to start polling, please do so. I don't see anybody, and we're going to share those results. Hopefully you can see those results now. Okay, so and again, panelists, if you have some suggestions as we walk through here, the first question, the first selection, there was a little bit of a trick question. So pull plants before harvest. Certainly we would want to do that. What we can't do with a crop like Palmer amaranth is we can't pull them and let them lay. So if you did that, you'd just be putting the seeds right back down on the ground, actually doing the plant a little bit of a favor. So we need to pull and remove those plants before harvest, which would be, so the second choice would be a little bit of a better choice. Hope for better luck next year. I'm glad nobody selected that. I can tell you we have a lot of folks that do that, and unfortunately it just doesn't work out real well. Map where Palmer is present is something that we always like to do, so good selection there. And we talked about mowing. So mowing the infested area before harvest really won't do much in terms of preventing that seed from getting laid down and coming up next year, or from actually putting some seed on your bush hog or your mower and carrying that to the next field as well. So when you really need to mow, if you want to terminate a field, if you see Palmer amaranth and it's the first plant you've ever had and you just want to get rid of it, some folks will go in and mow it while it's early. But Mark, I think you wanted to make a comment about how fast Palmer can actually produce seed.
Yeah, the question, a lot of times folks ask if, they'll look at a plant and say, well, does that have seed? And they'll see like a green, lush growing plant. And generally, weeds will start producing viable seed within about 2 weeks of flowering. And on a plant like Palmer, their flowers are so small, they're hard to see. And so essentially, once you start to see the seed heads, within 2 to 3 weeks of that seed head emerging, the plants will start having viable seeds on them. So it happens very quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Van Gessel. All right, so the next question, what are you going to do during soybean harvest? I like this first response. Close your eyes, run the combine, and move on to the next field. Next year will have to be better. Got too much to do. Unfortunately, that sometimes happens when we're in a hurry to get things done. But that's just going to spread that weed seed to every field you have. So leave the weedy section of the field. That's certainly an option, particularly if you don't have Palmer amaranth in other parts of the farm. You could certainly leave it there. Now, if you leave it there, those seeds are going to be, obviously the seeds are going to stay there in that field, but you won't be moving it to other parts of the farm. Another option there is to harvest the infested areas last if hand weeding is not possible. And this one's really, really important, as well as the next one, clean that combine before moving out of the field. In our experience, the easiest way to move Palmer is with the combine. It moves really readily in the combine. In fact, that's how we first got Palmer amaranth in our area. It came in on a used combine out of the Midwest. So we're actually down south. So cleaning that combine, making sure you know where your equipment has been. That last option is also a great option. Harvest that field separately as a block with other infested fields and then clean the combine. All good choices there. All right, our final question. What are your plans for the field immediately after the soybean harvest? Will any additional management plans be implemented at that time? So some of our options there, we could plant a cover crop. Again, we're getting that out kind of late. I don't know, depending on what area you're in, it's a bit late to get that cover crop in and get any biomass if you're going to be planting corn in April, but certainly something to consider. Cover crop can really help with Palmer amaranth and with common ragweed. Strategic tillage in Palmer amaranth infested areas is another option. Dr. Flesner made the point, a very good point this morning. If we can do strategic deep tillage, so moldboard plowing, it'd be better to wait until the spring, give enough time to let those seeds lay on the ground. A lot of that viability is going to kind of go away over the winter time. Could be a lot of predation by insects and other things that eat those seeds. And then in the spring, go ahead and plow down what's left. And finally, the final choice is to use a residual herbicide this fall to keep Palmer amaranth suppressed. So Palmer amaranth, thankfully, it does have a long germination period. So it'll germinate from late April all the way, up until September. But thankfully, it does not germinate during the winter months. So it doesn't have a lot of benefit there to using that residual herbicide in the wintertime. All right, let's head on down here to the next question. All right, so we move to the next spring, 2 to 6 weeks before planting that corn crop. What are some things that you might consider doing? So go ahead and answer that. I'm going to launch the poll there. There we go. So you can go ahead and respond. What do you think are some good techniques 2 to 6 weeks before planting? We'll give you a little bit of time to go ahead and answer those so we can scout for any emerged weeds. We talked about strategic tillage earlier. That should be an easy one. Burn down early, planning out your residual. All right, we're getting some good responses in here. Good job. And share the results here. All right, so always a good idea for scouting. Now, 2 to 6 weeks ahead of corn planting, we're probably not going to see much Palmer amaranth, but it would be a good time to be looking for winter annuals. Strategic tillage, again, if you're going to use that and if that fits with your situation, obviously we can't plow everywhere, but where it does fit, that might be a good option. Burn down your cover crop and winter annuals as soon as possible to get a clean field early. So this is one where if you remember, we want to get as much biomass as possible. And typically to do that, we want to let that cover crop grow as long as possible. So that's probably not the best option. Next option is using multiple effective herbicides. So planning a good herbicide program. That doesn't mean putting it down 2 to 6 weeks ahead of time. That would be a big mistake. But when we go for burn down, we want to make sure that we're putting that on with multiple sites of action. So glyphosate, 2,4-D, glyphosate and dicamba, gramoxone, sharpen. Making sure we have multiple products, not just relying on glyphosate alone. Allow that cover crop to remain. Yep, we talked about that. That's definitely a good option. And finally, applying that residual herbicide early. So no, we don't want to put the residual herbicide on early. Let's get that down just as close to planting as possible. Okay, let's move to the next question. You guys are doing great. And we'll go down to question 17. All right, so it's time to plant. It's April, the sun is shining, soil's warm. How will you manage weeds at planting? So go ahead and respond there. So we can scout herbicide tolerant corn variety like a glufosinate type corn, early maturing corn, pre-emergent herbicide. Okay, so what are some things we can do? Of course, scouting for any emerged weeds and making sure we get those cleaned up. Now, my experience has been April 15th, we're not going to be seeing Palmer. It typically, in my area, doesn't start to germinate until a couple of weeks after corn has been planted. I don't know if the other panelists want to hop in there and share their experience with that as well. But that's one big advantage with growing corn, is that we can get that planted a little bit earlier. And remember, Palmer really likes warm weather. It grows really fast in hot conditions. But that means also if we can, in the cooler weather, when that corn gets up and growing, and actually get a few weeks ahead of that Palmer amaranth. So timing with corn can be a little bit of an advantage for us. Herbicide tolerant corn variety, that's another good choice. Liberty Link corn, just another tool in that toolbox for us. So early maturing corn might have a little bit of an advantage. I think the option here is looking at is the potential next fall to get in a earlier planted cover crop. Certainly that might be something that could help. Use a pre-emergent herbicide. So it looks like almost everybody got that. Good job there. And I'm really glad to see the next option, use the best herbicide you have, whatever type worked best on beans last year. So, you know, that's going to be something to consider. And as we move forward into some of this new soybean tolerant varieties that are coming up, there's going to be some herbicide chemistry that we can use on both corn and beans. And we want to make sure that we reserve products for soybeans that work best on soybeans and use different chemistry for corn, if at all possible. And then finally, include additional burn down material for escape weeds. We definitely want to do that. We don't want to have any weeds up when that corn's coming up. And finally, nobody responded that we should skip any burn down and put everything into a total post program. So we want to make sure we have a good residual there. Okay, we're going to go to the next question here. All right, what are we going to do during that growing season? So we launch that poll. Scout every week, monitor crop health, promote good, vigorous growth of that crop, get early canopy closure, spray by date, not by weed size, apply selective post-emergent treatment with a residual when weeds are small, and finally hand weed escapes. So I think this one should be fairly easy for folks. So scout every week. This is when it really gets important to make sure you keep an eye on how fast those weeds are growing and what's there. And this is true for fall panicum as well. Fall panicum is one that, with the springs that we've had, when we're getting delayed planting, a lot of rain, fall panicum can be one that's difficult to control. So if you need to catch fall panicum in corn, you need to do so early. And of course, that's true with Palmer amaranth. So monitor crop health, and this is one we often don't talk about, but it's probably just as important as any other weed management technique. We want to give every advantage to the crop that we can. So, you know, let's set that up with proper fertility, making sure we got the proper pH of the ground there. We're planting properly, good seed to soil contact so that plant can get up even and take off and grow. I'm very glad to see that most folks say spray by, don't spray by date, always go by what size that weed is, which is really critical for something like Palmer. Apply a selective post herbicide treatment with the residual when weeds are small. And so with Palmer, this is something that we often do, is we'll put in a over the top residual herbicide like Dual or Warrant or Zidua in with the post product. We'll put that on, 20, 24 days after planting, and that residual will help to extend the level of control that we get out a little further until that we get total canopy closure of that corn or that bean crop. So products like Post, Warrant, Zidua typically would be used with beans, but with corn, getting a residual down, a delayed residual like atrazine can also be very, very helpful. And of course, we want to hand weed those escapes before they go to seed. So good deal. You all did great on that one. We'll do one more, and then this is actually the last question. What tactics will you use to manage any escape weeds immediately before or after crop harvest? So this is when you're going into that corn to harvest. Let me go ahead and launch that poll. There we go. Folks can respond now. Scout for escapes, plant a cover crop. I like the last choice. Close your eyes, run the combine, move on to the next field. All right, I think you guys are getting the hang of this. So again, keeping an eye on the weeds we got, scouting for any escapes, marking that down where they're at. And then finally, this is the opportunity after that corn crop to get a nice cover crop in early where we can accumulate some biomass. Will really help with next year. Just a couple of resources. I think VJ talked about some of these as well. The Mid-Atlantic Field Crop Weed Management Guide. This is the book that we all use. If you can see it, there we go. Has a lot of good recommendations on herbicide selection, but also on management of herbicide or tough to control weeds. So if you don't have a copy of this, I encourage you to get one, or make sure you can rely on someone that does have one. There's a lot of information within your handouts that you've received that you can also rely on. The Grow website's a great resource with ideas for integrated weed management. We did want to acknowledge support for this project, particularly the Maryland Soybean Board, as well as throughout the Mid-Atlantic, University of Delaware, Virginia Cooperative Extension, University of Maryland.